We've heard about the great science that can be done.
And while that used to be true,
and I really have this bias.
The question is, where's the most difficult place that you can possibly get to in the world? Now let's next imagine that we as a species have been to both the moon and the deepest part of the ocean, but there are still several dozen mountains around the world whose summits have never yet been reached by anybody. There are still some shockingly difficult and remote places to get to in the world, and there are still some places that nobody in all of human history has ever been to yet. An international space station. Now let's next imagine that you are placed in the center of Devon Island, which is part of the Canadian archipelago. This island is roughly the same size as Croatia, and yet it has
the Opportunity rover. It's been on the surface now for over a decade, out there on the surface of Mars with robots, to really accomplish
that's absolutely zero.
And we've heard about the technologies we need to make this happen with humans on Mars, and we've heard about returning science that whole time.
Placed in the center of Devon Island,
which is completely amazing, and that's the actual people get to Mars.
There have even been explorers like nobody.
To really accomplish the science.
Walk in any direction and you will never find anybody else to help you.
But in that time, it's gone a little over 26 miles to get to Mars.
And you would need a boat to get there.
So think about what a human brings to the equation. I'm a field geologist, but there's something critical here.
It's absolutely zero.
Mobility, flexibility, creativity. I'm a field geologist.
Maybe you think that the South Pole would have to be one of the most remote and far away places in the world.
So all of this is getting us to this point of getting humans ready to go on that long journey,
which is
to Mars.
The Canadian archipelago that is always staffed. Now let's next imagine that you are 150 scientists. The place that is far more remote and difficult to get to or out of would be this
laboratory is from the inside and microscopes, and then of course.
Now let's next imagine that
do we need people on the space station? Why can't we do this with robots? Why do we need astronauts on that journey to Mars can have fresh people? And the astronauts ate it. They said it tasted fine.
So unless you want to wait around for years to be rescued, then you should probably get moving. So far, we've only been talking about being on land. This point in the Arctic Ocean, it is located on a shifting pack of ice.
Don't we? Shouldn't we? Wouldn't we? Apparently, they don't cut through the ice, even though it sounds like they could. It's strange. I don't know. I need to learn more about it.
So if you want to become an explorer, then get out there and reach it first. And finally, the most remote point from the rest of humanity, which for reference on a globe looks like this and almost takes up half of everything you see. This exact point here is known as Point Nemo. This exact point here is known as Point Nemo. It's on a globe, looks like this, and almost takes up half of everything you see. This exact point here is known as Point Nemo. It's on a globe, looks like this.
So is Antarctica there or not? Can you see South America there or not? What about the gaping black hole in the data of Antarctica?
It's on a globe, looks like this.
So you hear about problems with the flat Earth map, but what about the scale and problems of the globe?
Okay, let's compare the so-called hemispheres. On a globe, how does that make sense?
That you have almost zero traffic at 50 degrees south, when at 50 degrees north, there's tons of traffic.
Now let's next imagine you are at this point sitting in a boat alone. The closest other humans to you would actually be the astronauts on board the International Space Station. It's weird to think that as they occasionally orbit the UK overseas territory in the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
This map shows sensibly why there are no shipping lanes going through the area.
Center in Madagascar.
Again, you can see why the shipping lanes don't cross anywhere near the island.
Antarctica is already difficult enough to get to with no regularly scheduled flights from anywhere in the world. But the volcano is located in the most remote part of Antarctica.
I'm sorry to keep you. I would like to book a flight.
With no regularly scheduled flights from anywhere in the world.
When would you like to leave?
Today.
known as Mary Birdland, a place so vast and remote that no sovereign country in the world currently claims it. With no regularly scheduled flights from anywhere in the world.
I'm sorry, I don't have anything for at least a month.
A month?
It's the busy season.
It's basically like being on the moon here. It wasn't even discovered until 1934.
Well, make other arrangements.
Moon, a place that no human has ever set foot on in all of history. And it seems like everywhere has already been discovered. Now let's next imagine that there are satellites, an international space station, a place that no human has ever set foot on in all of history, and GPS,
And shark.
Oh, Walter. Land shark.
there are satellites. The world used to literally at the beginning of humanity. We go back to Ethiopia in 195,000 BC. 40,000.
Why? 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 They couldn't walk? It took tens of thousands of years?
For the first time, humans arrived in Australia 48,000 years ago.
Using boats.
Land shark.
47,000 years ago, humans arrived in Japan.
And
Using
shark.
boats.
And 1,000 years later, somehow skipped France and arrived in the UK around 43,000 years ago.
And shark.
Oh, Walter. Land shark.
On the other side of the world, humans had discovered Tasmania 41,000 years. 34,000 years ago, humans got around to discovering Sri Lanka.
Land shark.
And then we discovered
Using a
another
boat.
new continent. North America was settled 25,000 to 40,000 years ago from across that land bridge
And shark.
that used to exist.
Oh, Walter. Shark.
Because walking somewhere is somewhat easier than inventing boats to sail there.
And shark.
Inventing?
And that's why there were millions of people already here when Columbus arrived.
Walter.
Well, when did they invent boats, and why did they need them?
Portugal was
Or not
finally
need them?
reached
I don't know.
24,500 years ago, and Sicily 20,000 years ago.
Land shark.
So, strangely, this means that humans had reached North America before humans reached Portugal.
And shark.
Yeah, that's strange.
Oh, Walter.
But anyway, and Ireland in 7,700 BC.
And shark.
Over in Asia, Cambodia was reached in 7,000 BC, because walking somewhere is somewhat easier than inventing boats to sail there.
Land shark.
Malta was discovered in 5,200 BC.
What?
And across another ocean, Puerto Rico was eventually discovered in 4,000 BC,
Why so late?
which coincidentally is when the Sid Meier's Civilization games all began. This is presumably when people started sending out their settlers for the first time.
What the heck? What were they doing before? Now, I'll make some sense of this in a little bit, but here they start to get into some real history. The rest so far has
A while
been
went by
BS.
with no new discoveries until 290 AD, undisturbed by the rest of humanity until 1778. Those early settlers
Yeah.
to Australia and
Because
their descendants would
nothing's
remain
happening.
almost completely undisturbed by the rest of the human
ages and
population
ages,
until
and
1770,
you have
when that
these, That gives
same
you a
guy
big
named James
clue.
Cook
You know, people start to explore, they start to keep records. 4,000 BC, well, that's exactly 6,000 years ago, and that's what, young Earth creationists have been saying is the age of everything anyway. And so all the BS and these long ages and barely anything happening, and it takes tens of thousands of years for them to walk, 100 miles over to some other savannah or something. It's such nonsense. I mean, where did the humans even come from? Why were they only in one spot if they didn't get off of an ark or get scattered from one particular city? Where did the Neanderthals come from, and why aren't they humans as well if we interbred? What the heck? It doesn't explain anything. It's insanity. And how do they skip over areas? And did they not have boats, or did they have boats? And if they didn't have boats, then why did they, how did they get to these other islands before, when they were needing a land bridge to get somewhere else. That's why I put the land shark in there, because it's absolute. It's just as nonsensical as a land shark, the land bridge. The idea, the Polynesians didn't have boats. Humans needed a land bridge. How did the Polynesians not have boats? How does any of that make sense? It doesn't.
As
When
well.
things really
Anyway,
started.
the next big discovery, 500 AD.
And shark.
The Roman Empire rose and fell, and in that entire time there were no humans on Madagascar, because walking somewhere is somewhat easier than inventing boats to sail there. What else is weird is that the first settlers here didn't come from Africa like you would think, but came on canoes all the way from Borneo across the entire Indian Ocean.
Oh, Walter.
Between 1250 and 1300.
Land shark.
Next, we enter the Great Age of European exploration, human discoveries of a few scattered islands.
From the 4000 BC, 1700, which is when they, I believe, added approximately 1,000 years, because we're not living that many centuries past the time of Christ, when the whole world
South
was
Georgia.
known. Okay.
Well, that's about it.
Yeah, except for the continent of Antarctica.
Antarctica was never even seen with human eyes until 1820, when this Russian explorer discovered it.
Or whatever you want to call it. Now, here is a book called An Accurate Description of America. And in chapter 1, it's somewhat, it's sardonically written, America Unknown to the Ancients. And what I mean by it being sardonic is it is intentionally sarcastic, overtly sarcastic, because when you read it, certainly America was known to the ancients. And that goes along with the true history when you start to discover these things, that the whole world was known basically from the beginning of its being settled each time. Now, the first time is when the progeny of Adam and Eve, mainly it was the descendants of Cain, who were scattered and populated the earth, but it included all people, and then when they were all wiped out in the Great Deluge, then the ark landed in modern-day Turkey, and from there out came the 8, Noah and his 3 sons and all their wives, and they pretty much stayed in that area for maybe about a millennia, when people turned bad again and the Tower of Babel was constructed. And when they were scattered because of that, because of the languages, the confusion of the languages, everybody scattered around the known world, and they came upon a lot of the antediluvian structures and inhabited them. So this means, thus, if Asia or Europe furnished America with people in Abraham's time, or at least before the birth of our Savior, then it must, upon necessity, by the expiration of so many ages, have been much more populous than the Spaniards found when they discovered it. Besides, the vast territories yet uninhabited, they say. But the author really disagrees and is saying there are sufficient testimonies that the New World had already been planted, scatteringly, yeah, and it was currently uninhabited. but not many ages since, the country would have more abounded with inhabitants, except something had happened early on. The fertility of the soil and everything would have sustained millions more people in that amount of time there would have been. The apostles, I learned, and I believe, the apostles meant what they said. Jesus meant what he said about them declaring salvation to the utmost borders of the earth. So if that's true, then that the Ravens expound shepherd, or I don't know how to pronounce it, Sephard or whatever, to be Spain, he therefore concludes that Obadiah prophesied of the Spaniard and their conquests in America. So they would prove that America was long known before Christ. And lastly, it signifies as little what Pineda and I don't know how to pronounce the names, Lemus, whatever, drive it, that Solomon first found the use of the compass, rigged a navy, and from which the Red Sea, it had no indirect course to the Straits of Magellan, from whence he might lade his vessels with the gold of Peru. So clearly what he means is that their narrative of the Solomon making use of the compass just to go around and putz around on the Red Sea, that clearly, actually, Solomon was going around the whole earth. And so with the astrolabe, okay, the compass, the sextant, and the astrolabe, that's all you need. They had that thousands of years ago, or, before the time of Christ, well before the time of Christ. They had all those things, so they did navigate the whole earth already. Everything was found. It wasn't just the Red Sea. It's so small-minded. They knew mankind, and Solomon had the greatest wisdom. There's nobody who's ever lived who didn't know as much as Solomon was made privy to. He was privileged to have known more about everything than pretty much anybody else who ever lived, and that may include Enoch as well. So that tells you, they did. They knew already a long time ago, probably continually from when the people were scattered from the Tower of Babel, scattered across the whole earth. They may have already had it mapped out at that point anyway. If it wasn't handed down from the Ark of Noah, they certainly had the ability, I believe, to have mapped it out on their own with the technology and skills that they had in place, which go beyond what we have today, even if satellites were outer space things like they say they are, which they're not. I think there are lands that were known before that we have forgotten about, or that we don't know about. There's much to be learned, much to be explored today.
So most of us have learned through time that we should listen to the textbooks and the scholars and the scientists about
the past and not to listen to the Bible and not to listen to the traditions and beliefs of people like me, people like your father or your grandfather, if it differs from the so-called science. Well, this map that I'm showing you now is from, supposedly it's 1587. It may be much older, and it's a map that was created by somebody named Urbano Monte. And this map shows the continent of Antarctica long before 1820. And though there is in the official narrative an explanation, not a logical one, but it's just a stated explanation that somehow people knew that the continent was there because of the ice coming off of it. But I don't believe that, because if you can get close enough to be able to see these icebergs, then you would have known that you could go a little farther and see the land. But they actually mapped the coastline. But okay, a little bit more of the official narrative, and then that'll be it for this one.
That means that humans had seen the planet Uranus before anybody had ever seen Antarctica.
Again, this flat Earth map is from
That's the
1587.
Urbano Monte map, the full thing. That's the full Monte, but Uranus ain't part of that.
It wasn't until 1895 that the first confirmed landing happened by a team of Norwegians.
There's one map in particular, like here, so they're showing Antarctica, and there are these just weird creatures. Now, I must say this. There's like a monkey with a man's head, or just weird crap.
And with that moment, every piece of land on planet Earth from 195,000 BC all the way until 1895 had been finally landed on by the human species.
There's a lion eating an alligator, and there's like Ozzy Osbourne in the ocean, you know, with all kinds of weird crap. So I don't know what is the meaning of this.
So where were the human species people before 195,000 years ago?
We know where it comes from. Urbano Monte made this map 430 years ago, but they have to also say all this stuff. According to the medieval map, not the Earth revolves around the Sun, and our Sun and Moon revolve around it. Urbano Monte's map gives a very detailed and accurate picture of the whole globe. Although it was made only 95 years after the discovery of America, which is not true, which is very strange to say the exact thing. Impossible. What? In order to create a detailed and accurate map of the world in such a short time, it is necessary at least to have a satellite system. We still don't have that. Or to rely on the older maps of the... and you can learn everything, because the effort and work I put in, I do appreciate, you know, contributions. But, and with that eloquent note, I will end this episode. I bid you adieu.